Hey, okay, so I hope you can hear us. I hope this thing is working. Guess we'll find out in about an hour or so.
I hope it's working too. This, otherwise, we're just wasting time talking. We're not actually recording if this doesn't work.
But, I think that's a risk worth taking. And,
Today is season 1, part 1, episode 1, and we are going to review the book Star Wars: The Princess, the Scoundrel, and the Farm Boy.
okay, so we're gonna take about an hour on this. Let's see how many chapters we get through. So, because the whole point of all of this is for us to break down the lore for people who don't understand the franchise all that well, we're going to start with the introduction. This story begins, as so many do, a long, long time ago in a place far beyond the glittering stars you see in your night sky.
So, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away.
In the time of the Old Republic, hundreds of star systems lived together in peace and prosperity, protected by an ancient order of warriors, the Jedi.
But that was before the Dark Times, before the Empire.
But a tide of darkness swept through the galaxy, as unstoppable as it was terrifying, wiping out even the most powerful fighters. Okay, so I just realized, so how do, should you just chime in whenever you have thoughts?
No, wait, I got it. Once I click this, if I click this, that means I want to talk.
Okay, I'll just keep the microphone close to me until you click it. Got it?
Okay.
Now, an evil empire rules the stars, slowly extinguishing the last traces of light and hope in its crushing grip. Now, how the empire came to be is an interesting story, but it's one for another day.
Yeah, it's definitely one for another day.
Despite the odds, a spark of rebellion lives on. And how that spark came to be is also a story for another day. This stuff gets complicated. Yep.
We'll simplify it much, much later.
Having won their first victory against the Empire, another story for another day, guys. I am sorry. I mean, guys, gals, and whoever is listening.
Let's just say that this is the story we'll be telling, and everything else is another story for another day.
The rebels turn their attention to reports of a weapon powerful enough to destroy planets and obliterate any last hope for freedom. But as you well know, heroes emerge from the most unlikely places at the most unexpected times. This is a story of destiny, of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The right time. Of courage, and yes, of a force more powerful than imagination. But it is also the story of a princess, a scoundrel, and a farm boy. Now, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this particular princess, this particular scoundrel, and this particular farm boy.
For those who aren't, we'll be explaining that in this book.
No, there's so much more to them than that. Perhaps they will surprise you. Perhaps they will surprise themselves. Perhaps they are the heroes the galaxy has needed all along. Now, we're going to start off talking about the princess, who is imprisoned in this handy little location, which you might recognize.
Or might not.
Chapter 1. Leia wasn't the girl they thought she was. That girl might have seen this plan through successfully. The crew of the Tantive 4. Okay, so according to the radio drama, yes, there was a radio drama. It's pronounced Tantive 4. I wholeheartedly reject that. It looks like Tantive, I'm calling it Tantive, okay? Okay. Thought Senator Leia Organa would be able to get them untangled from the net she'd flown them straight into.
I would call it Tantive 4.
But her plan had gone wrong. So wrong. There wasn't any way out, any way to save them. She had let them down, and now there was only one hope for completing her mission. Leia had never been inside the access corridors on the ship. They were meant for droids and technicians to get around without being trampled underfoot by the crew. Her heart thundered in time with her boots as she ran, and she was sure she'd never find the labor pool. Now, in case you're curious, this is the Tanti 4. Pale corridors and paths were lit only by a few crimson lights, and parts of it were so tight she barely managed to squeeze through without whipping her dress. Blasted of every color under every sun, why had she chosen to wear white? She stood out in the darkness like a reactor core, an easy target. Was it really that much colder in there, or was her mind playing tricks again? A deafening blast roared through the silence, rattling the ship down to its metal bones. Leia gasped as she was thrown against a wall of circuits and pipes. The screams of blaster rifles and heavy marching steps thundered in her ears, muffling the screams and shouts of the men and women trying to hold off the invasion. They'd been boarded, and it sounded like the fight was raging right over her head. Leia ran harder until her lungs burned. This is my fault, she thought, tears stinging in her eyes. I told Father this was my mission. I just wanted him to be proud of me. She had only wanted to help the rebellion. Why did the crew have to lose their lives to save others? Her father hadn't wanted her to accept the mission. She had seen it on his face as he told her, I don't doubt your capabilities, not even for a moment. Taking on all these responsibilities, they've shaped you into a glittering star. You are remarkable, but this is too dangerous, Leia. Okay, obviously we all know it's not too dangerous for Leia. I mean, come on, it's Leia, but Dad's got a dad. Leia had fought to control her temper. A star. In other words, something beautiful, something to be admired from a distance. The simpering princess, her...
If I had a nickel for every time a dad told their kid in Star Wars that this mission is too dangerous, I'd be rich.
Her aunts had tried to force her to become her whole life. Okay, so those aunts... Believe it or not, another story for another day. Like I said, this is complicated, but don't worry, they're actually really nice people. They're adorable, they've got these cute little pets. But, yeah, not particularly helpful when it comes to the whole rebellion stuff. Someone who would ignore the calls of a rebellion desperate for help in stealing information. She loved them with her whole heart, and even when she felt like flipping the table over during her aunt's ruthless etiquette lessons, and running away to join a galactic circus just so he wouldn't have to hear another lesson about the difference between a soup spoon and a dessert spoon. So, yeah, they have circuses in Star Wars. And also spoons. One day, yes, she would be Queen of Alderaan like her mother before her, but that day was far off, and there was more to being a fair ruler than learning the correct way to wave to her people. Her aunts had fought both Leia and her father on her joining the Galactic Senate. They would rather have seen her in her chambers, twirling her hair and daydreaming about which sniveling prince to marry, than in a Senate box trying to bring about real change and reform. Okay, by the way, not all the princes in Star Wars are sniveling, but yeah, a lot of them are. The press was even worse, claiming she was a princess playing dress-up and not a real diplomat and politician. They saw the image her aunts had crafted for her, and not the person her father had trained her to become. No matter how many times she traveled the length of the galaxy to bring attention and aid to the suffering, still, the media refused to look past her label of princess. One time she'd been holding an orphan baby Wookiee, walking through a village the Imperial forces had burned to embers and ash. Oh yeah, by the way, the Empire likes burning Wookiee stuff.
The Empire is just awful.
And the Wookiees, they are very unlucky. They always get the short end of the stick whenever they show up. Poor Wookiees.
It's happened multiple times throughout the entire franchise, but as for the Empire, they're still just awful. Horrible.
And the first question she'd taken from the reporters from the Central Systems was, who designed the outfit you're wearing? Not, why are we here? Not, what can the galaxy do to help? The only thing Leia had successfully managed to do in her time in the Senate was irritate the Emperor like a sunburn that refused to fade. She'd gone into the chamber ready to fight anyone who stood in her way, and what she'd seen there had surprised her more than knocking heads with an opponent would have. No one seemed to care. Or at least no one wanted to test the Emperor's patience. She didn't understand how anyone could sit still in the Senate knowing about the crimes being committed in the Outer Rim. Imperial interrogation camps, the execution of supposed traitors in cold blood, whole cities destroyed in what Darth Vader called purifications. Apparently planets need to be purified of any ideas resembling democracy. Or hope. By the way, in case you're curious, all of this is actually a reference to the radio drama because the author, she's gone on record that she's a big fan of the radio drama, so yay that that's still canon and all. It made her sick. She could still smell the charred remains of buildings and lives. See the newly orphaned children lined to be what? Sold as labor to the highest bidder? Sent to the spice mines of Kessel? Okay, so, suppose you want to know what spice is. It's...
I know what spice is. It's space drugs.
And we're not talking melatonin here. We're talking, the...
The heavy stuff.
Oh, yeah. Yes, cocaine? Maybe heroin? I don't know. It varies depending on the offer what any particular spice is a metaphor for. But yeah, you can mine it. Though on Kessel, it wasn't so much mined as...
Forced labor, imprisonment.
Well, okay, specifically the forced laborers, the prisoners, slaves, let's call them what they are. They have to get it from the webs of giant spiders that eat people. But it's weird, it's hilarious, it's dumb, and we love it. We love it so much.
That's why the Empire sends people to Kessel as a death sentence.
Every time Leia tried to demand answers in the Senate chamber, she'd been reprimanded, silenced. She wanted to shout, shake them, force her colleagues to see what she saw. But they refused. Some told her to go back home, to enjoy palace life. Leia realized it didn't matter what she said, or how loudly she shouted. No one was listening. So when Leia first learned of the rebellion, she had all but jumped at the chance to be part of it, to be recognized for what she could do, not who she was, to actually help the galaxy. This was her chance to prove herself, and she thought her father would understand that if nothing else. Stealing top-secret plans from the Empire was a risk, but being dismissed as a twinkling ball of gas had only made her more determined. The mission should have been simple. All they needed to do was intercept a transmission about a new battle station the Empire was rumored to be building. Okay, so, by the way, this novel came out before Rogue One, so obviously there are going to be a few inaccuracies here and there. So let's just assume that the stress of it all is making Leia remember things wrong, okay? Can we do that? Can we meet the authors halfway? I think we can do that. But the system had been swarming with Imperials. They'd caught on to Leia's bogus tale about her ship breaking down, but the cover had helped her stall long enough to download...
Let's just say it's a rebel team that stole the Death Star plans.
Hopefully we'll get to their novel one day, but that could be years off. We don't even know how long we're going to do this. They'd caught on to Leia's bogus tale about her ship breaking down, but the cover had helped her stall long enough to download the tactical plans for something codenamed Death Star. Despite the rebels' efforts to lose the Imperials in the jump to hyperspace, the hulking Star Destroyer had caught up to them. And Leia knew the moment the ship identified itself as the Devastator, there would be no escape. It was Darth Vader's ship. Vader's never been one for subtlety, with names or anything else, really.
He is a master of making a dramatic entrance.
She ran harder, ducking through shadows and bursts of warm steam. Her hand tightened around the data card as she made a sharp turn. Then, something silver caught her eye. A droid, an astromech droid even. Thank the stars. Her plan actually had a chance of working. The droid looked like an R2 unit. Its squat cylindrical body was topped with a dome-shaped head and panels of rich blue. A single indicator glowed red, then blue as the droid rolled by. "Droid!" Leia called, tucking herself into a dark alcove. "Droid, come here!" The head swiveled toward her, letting out a friendly, questioning chirp. The droid rolled toward her on 3 legs, and then Leia now down so she was level with it. As much as she hated to admit it, and she hated it a lot, Leia was grateful her aunt had spent years drilling her on public speaking, so that, as princess, and sometimes queen, she could give speeches without embarrassing herself. She had to get the message right on the first try. There simply wasn't time to redo it. Leia closed her eyes a moment, steadying herself with deep breaths the way her aunts had shown her. When she spoke, she was proud of how clear and careful the words were. "R2 unit, I need to record the following holographic message. Do you have that programming, R2? The droid beeped in reply. Good enough. Leia stood upright and stepped back. Message begins. Now. She cleared her throat, taking the regal tone her aunt loved, the one she'd sharpened like a knife in the Senate. General Kenobi, years ago you served my father in the Clone Wars. Now he begs you to help him in his struggles against the Empire. I regret that I am unable to present my father's request to you in person, but my ship has fallen under attack, and I'm afraid my mission to bring you to Alderaan has failed. Admitting she failed made the words taste bitter in her mouth. Though she and the crew of the Tantai 4 downloaded the information and made the jump to Tatooine, she wouldn't be able to complete the second part of the mission. Her father had requested that she seek out an old friend, one General Kenobi, because, in his own words, a war demanded warriors to fight. A legendary Jedi Knight, Kenobi had gone into secret exile on the remote desert planet to avoid the deadly purge that had wiped out his order. Okay, so in case you're curious how Obi-Wan knows Leia's dad, well, okay, this Leia's dad, not the... Oh my, but... yeah, there's a novel about that, but that one is another one that's a long ways off. Suffice to say, they are good buddies, very close.
They were friends during the Clone Wars.
And the Clone Wars is its own thing that, trust me, we will get into. But in the meantime, suffice to say, good old Leia's dad, okay, I'll just call him by his name, Bail Organa. He's the only one that knows that Obi-Wan's still alive. And the only one that knows where he is. Well, okay, with a few exceptions here and there. Oh, by the way, here's what Leia looks like at this point in the story. Sorry that there's no color, but just imagine that dress is super white and makes her look like a massive target in the grays and reds and all that. Leia pressed on. I have placed information vital to the survival of the rebellion into the memory system of this R2 unit. My father will know how to retrieve it. You must see this droid safely to Alderaan. This is our most desperate hour. Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi. You're my only hope. Leia paused, wishing she felt more relieved than she did at having completed the message. But it was only the first step of one last desperate mission. And she hated placing such a valuable intelligence in the hands of a droid that didn't even possess hands. End of message. Now here comes the truly difficult part, R2. I need you to deliver this message, along with the information I am about to upload, to a man named Obi-Wan Kenobi. He resides on the planet beneath us, away from civilization. You'll need to search for him and him alone. The droid rocked side to side on its back two legs, beeping at acknowledgement. R2? R2-D2, where are you? Leia spun, looking for the source of the voice. She squinted, just barely making out the gold humanoid form of a prodigal droid. R2! It was only then that Leia realized how quiet it had become. The firing and shouting had stopped. Some terrible part of her suspected it was because there was no one left from the Tantai 4 to keep fighting. The crew's battle was over. Hers was only beginning. Leia's hands flew over the droid, inserting the data card. Now you need a way off this ship. Yep. There should be at least one escape pod left for you to use. Do you follow? The R2 unit whistled another affirmative. Leia placed her hand on its smooth, round head and closed her eyes. Please let this work. Good luck. Safe travels. The image of the planet below them floated to the front of her mind. Tatooine's endless sand dunes gave it a beautiful warm glow, like an eternal sunrise. Now, if any one of you knows anything about astrophysics, you know that planet being a whole desert sounds unrealistic. Well, suffice to say, Tatooine didn't used to be like that, but suffice to say, a while back, the locals ticked off some very powerful people, and thanks to a little something called orbital bombardments, anything that was not sand was quickly turned into sand. So yeah, poor Tatooine. She could see it now as the droid rolled away, how he would struggle to navigate with the sand in his gears. But he could do it. She squeezed her hands into fists at her sides, pushing down the fear. Leia had faith. R2-D2 at last, the prodigal droid cried. I've been looking all over for you. Leia drew her hood up over her head, carefully sliding her blaster out of its hidden holster. There was a way out for her. There had to be. Leia, like her father, refused to accept impossible odds. She just needed time to think. A safe place to hide. As the sounds and voices of the droids disappeared, new ones echoed over to her. Precise, sharp steps. The clicking of armor. Low voices. Stormtroopers. Leia pressed her back further into the shadows, squeezing her gun to keep her hand from shaking. She was all the droid had now. There was still time to create enough of a distraction for it to reach an escape pod and blast down to the planet's surface. But stars, she couldn't get her heart to slow down. Her breathing sounded loud to her own ears. It wouldn't be her first time in a firefight. It wouldn't even be her first firefight that month. But there was so much at stake. She couldn't let all the lives lost that day be for nothing. She was afraid that the mission would be a failure, that the Devastator would blast the droid's escape pods into a trillion pieces. That she'd Sorry, little glitch with the computer. That she'd never return to Alderaan, that the rebellion would be demolished, that she'd never see her father or mother again. But fear was a useless emotion. She needed to fight, and the only way she knew how to burn through her fear was to summon her anger. All she had to do was think of the Emperor's sickly eyes, his cackling laugh that crept all over her skin like freezing fingers. Leia had met the evil told from the first time, just after she'd been elected as Alderaan's senator. Her father was to present her to the Emperor on Coruscant with all the newly elected officials. While her aunts had spent the days leading up to the trip debating her hairstyle and which dress she should wear, Leia had spent that time listening on out her grievances, the things she'd be fighting to change. She wanted to tell the Emperor to his face. She was the youngest senator ever elected to the Imperial Senate, and she was going to make an impression, fire off a warning shot at the start of what was going to be a long war for the good of the galaxy. It didn't matter to her if she made some enemies in the process. But she had walked up to the black throne. The old man had lifted his head, revealing the deathly pale, wrinkled skin of his face. His eyes had seemed to glow, piercing right through her. The words lodged in her throat, and a cold sweat broke out on her neck. Leia barely heard her father say her name, barely felt the hand he placed on her back to guide her forward. Her aunt had drilled manners into protocol so deeply she caught herself automatically dropping into a curtsy. A curtsy! Before she could stop herself. "It will be nice," the Emperor croaked, a smirk twisting his bloodless lips, "to have such a pretty face in the Senate." Direct quote from one of the comics, by the way. So yeah, nice deep cut on the part of the offer. And that had been it. He had spoken to her like she was as much a piece of decoration as the chamber's statues. Leia hadn't been able to summon a single word to protest it. Just thinking about it made bile rise in her throat. There. That was better. A steady, warm flush of anger flooded her system. Her focus sharpened, homing in on the stormtrooper stepping into the corridor through a nearby hatch. "Search every passageway and compartment," the leader ordered. "You two, check behind those power conduits." Of all the rotten luck, the pipe behind her released a hiss of steam and rattled loudly, making one of the stormtroopers turn back around. "Wait, I thought I saw something." "Blasted white dress," Leia thought, aiming her gun. "There she is! Set your weapons to stun!" Leia wasn't about to set her blaster to stun. She fired, hitting the stormtrooper out in front. He let out a sharp cry as he crashed to the ground. By the way, if she had set her weapon to stun, it still would have worked. Stormtrooper armor sucks. "Watch it, she's armed! Fire!" The firing would draw even more attention. She'd have to run, find better cover to hold them off just a little longer. But the moment Leia turned her back, it felt like she'd been tackled from behind by a Star Destroyer. The hit from the stun bolt took all the feeling from her legs, sending her slamming forward against the rough grating under her feet. 1,000 sparks of light burst in Leia's eyes, momentarily blinding her. "Move!" she ordered herself, even as helplessness rolled through her. "You're not done yet." "She'll be all right," she heard the first stormtrooper say. "Inform Lord Vader we have a prisoner." Chapter 2. Sensation flooded back into Leia's numb arms and legs as she was hauled onto her feet. It felt like she'd been filled with sand. Her first few steps were stumbles, as the whole galaxy seemed to wobble around her. The stormtroopers surrounded her, snapping binders over her wrist. They thought they could take her prisoner? Her? Leia knew she hadn't held much weight with the other senators, but she was well aware that the public cared about her. Any whisper of mistreatment would set the HoloNet on fire. Was that a risk the Emperor was willing to take? She sincerely hoped not. Okay, so... You know what, even if we have... nuts. We have no way of knowing if the microphone is actually working. I can't believe we recorded the entire chapter not knowing that.
I think it is working.
Alright, we're just gonna trust that it is. Trust that I didn't accidentally click the mute button or something like that. And we're gonna keep going. Leia knew she hadn't held much weight with the other senators, but she was well aware that the public cared about her. Any whisper of mistreatment would set the HoloNet on fire. Was that a risk the Emperor was willing to take? She sincerely hoped not. "How dare you!" she seethed, her lips still numb from the crackling electricity of the stun bolts. Even though it felt like her head was underwater, Leia twisted around, throwing her elbow back and kicking at the nearest stormtrooper's knee. In retaliation, the soldiers jostled her from all sides, shoving her forward when she refused to move. Leia knew that she was caught, but she wasn't going to be a willing captive. The main corridor of the ship was almost blindingly bright after the dark interior passageways.
Usually the Empire would be willing to let her go since she is part of the Imperial Senate, but I don't think the Imperial Senate will be much of a threat to the Empire anymore.
And we'll get to why soon. The main corridor of the ship was almost blindingly bright after the dark interior passageways. Smoke from the battle choked the air. Every time Leia drew on her breath, her legs burned with the sharp ozone stench left behind by blaster bolts. And everywhere, there were bodies. They'd been left where they'd fallen, their wounds and lifeless expressions turning Leia's stomach violently. She didn't want to see that. Those were her people, and she'd marched them to their deaths. There was no way to fix that, no way to make it better. Leia forced herself to look, to remember. She'd need to tell their families. She'd need to... My fault, she thought. My fault. Leia the senator, even Leia the princess, could justify their deaths as a necessary sacrifice, but Leia the human was having a hard time swallowing a scream. Darth Vader stood at the end of the hallway, his towering height and wide shoulders almost blocking the hole the Imperials had blown through the doors to get into the Tantive 4. Stormtroopers swarmed around him, their armor clicking like the exoskeletons of insects. As the Emperor's right hand, Darth Vader stood out in sharp contrast. His armor, flowing cape, and helmet were as black as the scorch marks on the walls. And at his feet was the crumpled form of Captain Antilles. Leia could hear the loud wheeze of Vader's breathing as the stormtroopers dragged her forward, but couldn't detect any sign that the captain was alive. Even him, Leia had been sure, or at least had hoped, they'd keep the captain alive for questioning.
If you thought the Emperor was terrifying, Darth Vader is just as terrifying as the Emperor.
Yeah, Palpatine might actually be worse. At least with Vader, you know where you stand. Palpatine seems like such a nice guy. Or at least he used to. Eventually he realized he could stop pretending, and he thoroughly enjoys showing everyone just how severely wrong he... And it's hard to put into words. Leia had been sure, or at least had hoped, they'd keep the captain alive for questioning. She'd banked on having his silent, steady support. Her chest seized with the shock of it, the pain. Her thoughts blanked out, overrun by anguish and fury. Captain Antilles had been an extraordinary leader. He'd broken through countless Imperial blockades to get supplies to the rebellion. And the crew had been so young, too. So much life wasted in a matter of minutes. She couldn't stand it. The war will go on without me, Captain Antilles had said. It won't without you. But in that moment, it all seemed impossible. I'm sorry, she thought. I'm so sorry. Rest assured that Ramus had a long... Oh, Ramus is Captain Antilles' first name. He had a long, productive life. He was a hero. But those are the stories of other writers. Let's focus on this one. But before we move on, I'm sure most people are familiar with who Vader is by now, but just in case you've forgotten. Civilian Leia was at a loss, but she felt some part of her click back and look into place as she faced Darth Vader. Senator Leia Organa had dealt with him before. She could face him again. She could use the ice that flooded her veins to steel herself in his presence. Leia straightened up, threw her shoulders back, hid her fear, but it was never easy to come face to face with a living nightmare, especially when it towered over her, when its hot, moist breath fanned across her face as it leaned toward her. Darth Vader, I should have known. Leia poured every ounce of the hate she felt into her voice. Only you could be so bold. The Imperial Senate will not sit still for this. When they hear you attacked a diplomatic, don't play games with me, Your Highness. You weren't on any mercy mission this time. You passed directly through a restricted system. Not for the first time, Leia thought he must have intentionally programmed his voice to be deep and rumbling like a thunderstorm. Which is actually true, by the way, because anybody who's heard his voice before he put the helmet on, or after, knows that it does not sound like this naturally. Several transmissions were beamed to the ship by rebel spies. I want to know what happened to the plans they sent you. Leia tried to ignore the way her little heart was galloping in her chest. The little droid would have to be away by now, shooting down to the planet out of Vader's reach. She had outmaneuvered him, maybe for the first time ever, and acknowledging that made it easier to keep her cool. I don't know what you're talking about. I'm a member of the Imperial Senate on a diplomatic mission. You are part of the Rebel Alliance and a traitor, he roared, swinging around to a nearby stormtrooper. Take her away. At his commands, the stormtroopers pushed her toward the hole they'd blown through the door of the Tantive 4. Leia strained her ears, trying to catch what an Imperial officer was reporting to Vader. She caught only a few words. We must be careful. The people adore her. Rebels, princess, planets. Blasted. Vader knew exactly what information they downloaded. The rebellion and all its members, including her father, were in more danger than ever, and it tore at her heart to know that it was her fault for letting the ship, the crew, and herself fall into the Empire's nets. As Leia left her battered ship for what she knew would be the last time, she could only hope she'd given that little droid enough of a chance to save them all. Chapter 3. One of the many dangers of being born royal, aside from death by boredom during her aunt's lessons, was the constant threat of abduction. As her mother was the Queen of Alderaan and her father the Queen's consort, to say they were wealthy and powerful was a vast understatement. When the seediest cretins came crawling out of the darkest corners of the galaxy looking for victims, Leia was a natural target for their greed. By the way, she actually has gotten kidnapped before, but that TV show didn't come out until long after this novel, so... Once again, hard to keep the continuity consistent with so many writers, but the fans do their best. So despite feeling there was something terribly unladylike about throwing things, mowing large, sweaty men around on wrestling mats, her aunt agreed with her parents that self-defense needed to become part of her relentless princess training when she turned 16. Leia had loved the rush that feeling physically strong had given her. It was the same buzzing sensation she felt every time she did something useful for the rebellion. Plus, the self-defense lessons had their unexpected uses. For instance, being able to punch a dummy made it easier to turn around later in the afternoon and learn 10 different ways to curtsy without kicking her aunts in the shins. And a single piece of advice from her instructor had saved her life 100 times over. Pay attention! Leia kept her mind clear and focused on the moment, her eyes open and scanning the Star Destroyer and every Imperial soldier around her. They had brought the Tantive 4 into a hangar bay that was mostly deserted. Of course, Leia was still a member of the Senate, and Vader would do everything in his vast power to hush up this incident.
Oh yeah, speaking of Leia's self-defense classes, you should know that she's one of the few Masters of Teräs Käsi.
That is a martial art specifically designed to combat Force users.
And a video game.
Not that it'll be of much use against Vader, because, come on, it's Vader. Leia was still a member of the Senate, and Vader would do everything in his vast power to hush up this incident, including, if she had to guess, destroying her ship and blaming her unfortunate death on some kind of mechanical malfunction.
The Empire does that a lot.
Canonically, they covered up this particular event as an attack by pirates. Her stomach clenched, twisted into knots. No, they hadn't killed her on the spot, but Leia was certain it had nothing to do with her being a senator or a princess, and everything to do with the answers Vader thought he could get out of her. What would happen after he realized she'd give him nothing about the rebellion? Leia would willingly jump out of an airlock into the freezing vacuum of space before she would betray her father and the people she'd come to think of as comrades. She had to get out, get the truth out. If she could just get down to Tatooine and find the droid and General Kenobi, she could still salvage the mission. And if nothing else, she could tell her father that she was still alive. Leia burned with the need to prove she hadn't failed him or the rebellion completely. She would never let herself wallow in the helplessness the Senate had tried to drown her in. There was still too much to do. The Star Destroyer's interior was exactly like the regime it served, cold and ruthlessly efficient. It was all sleek lines, everything in pure white or black. There was no gray in the Emperor's world. Okay, this one is very ironic, because in the movies, TV shows, video games, and pretty much any sort of visual media, comics for instance, Star Destroyers are gray. Most of what the Empire has is gray. Like, yeah, gray is a color traditionally associated with heroism, unlike white and black, both associated with villainy. But, yeah, I'm sorry, I just can't help but laugh at this part. I know what the author was trying to go for here. There was us, and there was them. There was his way or no way at all. Leia was hustled into a narrow silver tube of an elevator that shot her and her escorts up to a walkway at breakneck speed. She leaned around the broad shoulders and shining armor of the stormtroopers, trying to dodge their grips to see what was below. A series of hangars, as it turned out, each wide, echoing chamber featured impossibly tall ceilings and enormous metal doors to draw ships inside. You could fit the entire population of some planets here, Leia thought, shocked at their size. Okay, sci-fi writers have no sense of scale. Yeah, the Star Destroyer is big, but unless those planets are really sparsely populated, you're not going to fit an entire planet's population inside a single hangar. She saw sparks spraying up as engineers worked to repair ships, droids hauling in heavy pieces of machinery no man could have ever lifted, and assembled lines of troops drilling in formation. Compared with the others, the hangar they'd towed the Tantive 4 into was smaller, but already swarming with stormtroopers and Imperial officers. It was the third hangar they passed into that caught and held Leia's attention. There were 2 shuttles docked below, with only a single crew moving carts of supplies toward them. Someone's prepping for a trip, she thought. Her mind worked at light speed, and she saw her escape plan unfold as clearly as if the Emperor himself had rolled out a carpet for her. Yes, a small thrill of victory raced through her. She could work with that. Her spirits lightened for the first time in hours, and she felt the crushing pressure lift off her chest. The shuttles would be fueled, and the shuttles were outfitted with weapons. She could blast her way out, and by the time they realized what was happening, she'd be through Tatooine's atmosphere. Take that, she wanted to shout out to the other senators. She was about to prove exactly what she was capable of given the opportunity to try. Her membership in the rebellion still felt new, too fresh. It's not, by the way. She's been at this for years. She needed the mission to show them her dedication and how far she'd go for them if only they'd give her the support to get there. This, the story of her escape under Vader's nose, would solidify her bond with them that much more. No one, not the media, not her aunts, not even her father, would be able to deny that she was a fighter and deserved to have her voice heard.
Speaking of the rebellion, there are many different stories about how the rebellion was founded. All of them are very interesting. You should check it out.
I mean, if you have the time. We know you're not as emotionally invested in this as we are. If I don't get shot out of the sky first, she thought. No, she could do it. She'd had years of flight training. What makes you think Leia needs a pilot? Huh?
Yeah.
Okay, little inside joke, sorry. We won't indulge in that too often.
Yeah.
And, well, there were all those dunes to hide in. Let's see how Vader liked getting gritty sand in sensitive places in his armor. Okay, we won't go too into specific, because if we start to explain every inside joke, we'd be here even longer than we're already going to spend here, which is going to be a while. But
let's just say Vader does not like sand.
No, he does not. She found her chance as 2 of her escorts broke away, heading into a nearby command room. If she had to guess, to begin processing her into the detention block. Leia allowed the others to push her into another elevator. The doors had barely shut when she swung her browned hands inside the toward the control panel with a thwack, causing the car to jerk to a stop. The stormtroopers next door were thrown off balance, giving her the chance to swipe one of their blasters and fire. Stop! Too late for that, laser brain, Leia thought, glancing down at their stunned forms. Okay, I know laser brain sounds dumb, but it was in Empire Strikes Back, it has precedent. Neither of them had the key to her binders. She reached up to pull out one of the dozens of pins out of her hair and went to work jamming the electronic lock. Like the binders mattered. She could fly herself out of there blind, deaf, and with both arms and legs bound behind her back. The second the elevator door hissed open, Leia slipped out and scanned the empty hull. She turned back and fired a shot at the elevator's control panel. The door shrieked in protest, jamming over and over on one of the stormtroopers' feet. Leia blew a stray piece of hair out of her eyes in a huff of annoyance as she kicked her foot back into the car. The elevator door slammed shut. Leia slipped...
Speaking of Empire Strikes Back, we'll be doing that much later.
Yeah, we still got 3 books to get through before we get to the Empire Strikes Back ones. Leia kept up to the edge of the corridor, hanging back a few steps from the hangar's entrance. The air on the ship was dry and freezing cold, but Leia felt damp with sweat. Pulse fluttering, entering, she watched the engineers step through the hangar door together, speaking quietly. They turned, heading away from her. Leia was still clutching the stolen blaster as she slipped inside and made a run for the shuttle. The boarding ramp was down, her mind sorted through the dangers quickly, like she was flicking through a stack of sabacc cards. In case you're curious, sabacc is basically just poker, but in space. If no one was on board, she could just go. If someone was on board, she'd need to stun him, but she could use him as a hostage. Stars, her aunts would have expired on the spot hearing that unprincess-like thought. 2 or 3 people inside would pose somewhat more of a challenge. The thought slid to a halt at the same moment her feet did. Standing at the top of the shuttle's boarding ramp, hands on his hips, as solid and large as any of Alderaa's mountains, was Darth Vader. So, yeah, Leia's not getting away, because canon demands that she cannot. But, hey, maybe one or both of us will write a fanfic someday about what would happen if she did. You know?
Yeah, basically, she thinks she's gotten away, but then she heads to the top of the boarding ramp. Vader's standing there, and she's like, paralyzed with fear.
She's far from the first damsel in distress to have this problem with the Sith Lord. Fortunately for her, Vader's force powers are limited due to his cybernetics, so what he can do to her isn't too bad. Chapter 4. For a moment, Leia's breath caught in her throat. An admirable show of spirits, Vader's voice boomed. There was a hint of amusement in it that somehow made her anger flame hotter than her irritation at having been caught. Leia set her jaw to keep from grinding her teeth. He was mocking her. But the innocents have no reason to flee. Blast it, she thought. She should have known he'd only use her escape attempt as more proof against her. Time to pull out the one weapon she had and hope she aimed true. I am a member of the Imperial Senate. I have rights, including the right not to be illegally detained. You wear that title like armor, thinking it will protect you. No more, Your Highness. You have no rights and no protection now. The Imperial Senate is being dealt with as we speak. He stalked down the ramp, his heavy footsteps thundering in her ears. For a moment, Leia didn't understand. Dealt with? Did that mean... Yes, Vader said, circling around her. So, yep, they've all been fired, and possibly also executed. Well.
Except there was one guy that stayed who Palpatine force lightninged out of the entire room.
Watch the Lego Star Wars shows for that. It's great. The blaster flew out of her hands, sailing through the air to land in his. She whirled around, stunned. The now familiar cold prickle she associated with him was back, drawing freezing fingertips up and down her neck. When Leia's young and fairly shameless about eavesdropping on her parents' conversations, she overheard her father speaking about how Vader instilled fear in everyone around him, how he could control not only people but objects. Her father called it the Force. What she knew of this mystic energy and its power she knew from hearing stories of the Jedi, the knights who defended the Old Republic. But unless she'd misunderstood her father's tales, the Jedi had been good, kind, dedicated to peace. How could someone as twisted and heartless as Vader have mastered their power? Leia was so caught up in her thoughts she nearly missed the verbal blow he delivered next. The Emperor has disbanded the Senate. You are no longer a senator. What defense will you use now, I wonder? The whole feeling at the center of Leia's chest billowed out, shriveling up even the unkind comparison she was about to make between Vader and a prodigal droid missing crucial parts of its verbo brain. You are no longer a senator. Leia hadn't served long on the Senate, but she'd spent years fighting to be trained for the role. She'd let herself shape her future around that dream, the way it would open up her world beyond the quiet, dull, strangely powerless existence of being a princess. The disappointment of realizing no one in the Senate would ever see her as anything more had soured her feelings toward the idea, but she hadn't let it go. The rebellion was her way to see out her goals for a more peaceful, prosperous galaxy, but the Senate was supposed to be there at the end to help rebuild the galaxy once the Emperor was gone. Leia does realize they could just make a new Senate, right? It's not that hard. Apparently, the Empire was still capable of surprising her with its cruelty, its complete disregard for the law. Honestly, really surprised Leia is this frustrated at something like this. Empire has gotten up to much worse, but if we list that all, once again, we would be here all day. Never for a moment did she consider that the Senate might cease to exist. In an instant, her dreams had collapsed in on themselves like a black hole forming, and Leia felt hollow. Vader strode past her, toward the hangar's entrance. You will follow me, or I will make you follow me. Your choice. I need time, she thought, the blood pounding in her ears. Time to figure out another way. And then she knew enough to understand that the best way to find that time, and more important, stay alive, was to play the part of the prisoner. So Leia decided wisely not to tempt him, seeing as he could probably lift her using only his little finger, or, as she supposed, the Force. Okay, I know it's a serious moment, but the idea of Vader just walking along, Leia floating behind him. It's kind of funny.
Also, Vader's thinking in his mind, checkmate. I got you.
Not that chess existent. Wait, does it? Probably. Her nostrils flared in frustration at the thought of being yanked around the way her blaster had been. His black cape slipped on behind him, tempting her to slam a foot down on it just to see if he was capable of tripping. Bad idea. You do not tug on Darth Vader's cape.
I think we've all I think we all learned that from a certain comic. But I won't go into detail on that.
Darth Vader's appearance on the dark control deck sent the officers scattering back to their stations. Leia had never seen so many backs go rigid at once, like he yanked them all up by the hair. She turned toward the viewport, surprised to see the stars streaking by. When had they jumped to hyperspace? An older man in a neat gray uniform quickly made his way over to them. Leia recognized him as a captain by the arrangement of colored squares attached to his chest. That, and the way his voice shook, she heard Vader had a way of disposing of the officers who disappointed him, which seemed to be everyone he crossed paths with. Judging by the way the man looked like he'd blissfully lick Vader's boots clean if asked. Kinky. Leia didn't doubt it. Status, Captain? We're right on schedule, Lord Vader, coming out of hyperspace shortly. Shortly was a few moments later. Leia stood at Vader's side, hands bound again in a way that was making her feel capable of committing some very Vader-like behavior. Lady Vader? Okay, I know, I promised I'd stop making in-jokes. For real this time. For real this time. The officers on the deck stared at her openly, whispering to one another. Where are you taking me? She demanded. I still have diplomatic immunity as a princess of Alderaan. We've already arrived at our destination. Leia spun back toward the viewport. She was still, after everything, expecting to see Coruscant, the capital planet. And it's... Oh yeah, Coruscant's a beautiful place. Whole planet is one big city. And yes, nerds everywhere have pointed out that there's no possible way that could work in real life. It just... Look, you gotta just move on from the inherently unrealistic idea of an ecumenopolis. Coruscant won't be important until later. But when it is important, it will be very important. It's probably one of the top 10 most important planets in the entire galaxy. Alderaan's also on that list, by the way. Also a nice place. Really pretty.
I've been to Alderaan. It is beautiful. It's like a combination between fall, winter, and spring.
Oh yeah, one of the few planets to have multiple biomes, but all of them are very pleasant. But there was only a small gray moon hovering in the sea of stars. A moon that wasn't orbiting a planet? No, it had to be a small planet. It grew larger as they moved toward it, until it filled the viewport completely. By the way, there are actually moons that don't orbit planets in real life. They're called rogue moons, usually due to some gravitational anomaly separating them from their planets, but I'm not an expert on astronomy. Leia's heart sank to her feet. It couldn't be. How? The stars weren't winking around the hulking spear as she'd first thought. The flickering lights were swarms of TIE fighters moving in formation, screeching as they passed the approaching Devastator. Now, in case you're curious, this is a TIE fighter. See? Looks kind of like it's a big bow tie, but they're actually called that because TIE is an acronym, stands for Twin Ion Engine. No, Family Guy, it does not have anything to do with the country of Thailand. Ah, nuts. I just made a joke only my dad would get. Okay, back to the book. Those weren't craters marring the spear's surface, but plating and towers. The large crater she'd spotted right away was no crater at all. It almost looked like a circular dish. Leia realized she was trembling and clenched her hands to hide it. Death Star. The words came out in a horrified whisper. A second too late, Leia realized her grave mistake. Vader turned on his heel. Yes, the Death Star. The secret weapon you claim to know nothing about. The plans you claim you do not possess. Really, Your Highness, you made that far too easy. Well, glad to know Vader's sense of humor is still intact. Not a lot of him is. Blast. She could blame it on exhaustion or fear, but Leia might as well have just dangled the data card in his face. Think. She fumbled for a reasonable explanation, her pulse pounding at hers. No, there were whispers of it in the Senate. Leia talked right over her. Look closely. Do you see the dish? That is the prime weapon. When it fires, the galaxy will finally understand the Empire's might, and the rebellion could be virtually wiped out in a single shot. You're mad. This is insane! No, Your Highness, he said. This is power. Then why worry about your missing plans? She shot back. If you're so powerful, if the station is invincible, why does it matter? He sliced a hand through the air, cutting her off again. Since you are so curious about our new battle station, you'll be pleased to know you'll be our first honored guest.
Oh yeah, about power, if they need they have a super weapon as a symbol of power, but the thing is, power doesn't panic.
Yeah, that was a good line. Seriously, even if you absolutely do not care for Star Wars in any way, watch Andor Season 1. It's great. But anyway, yeah, it is kind of weird that Vader's boasting of the Death Star when just a few scenes later in the movie, he'll talk about how the ability to destroy a planet is insignificant next to the power of the Force. I mean, Vader it needed to be someone. Might as well be a named character who's doing this with Leia. Also, first honored guest. I don't know. They had a big prison bay, and I guess this explicitly confirms that one level of Battlefront 2, the 2005 version, isn't canon. Shame. That was a fun story. But yeah, Leia, only Death Star prisoner ever. Sad. Your quarters are being prepared for your arrival. Should you choose to continue to be uncooperative, you will find your stay immediately shortened. Permanently. Do you understand? Leia gritted her teeth but nodded. Know that there will be no escape this time, Princess, he warned. To try would be foolish. Sometimes, she thought, just sometimes, it was good to be underestimated. Leia turned back to the viewport, taking in the looming battle station with new eyes. Vader and his lackeys would find that out soon enough. Chapter 5. As she was transferred to the Death Star by shuttle, Leia kept her eyes open, wide open. She mentally mapped out the path they took from the hangar to the set of elevators. Counted each turn and the steps down every hall. She counted the clusters of marching stormtroopers as they made their way down the glossy corridors, noting which direction they marched. Droids zipped around her feet and blasted. She was thinking of the other droid again, the little R2 rolling through the desert sand dunes. Leia knew she needed to keep her mind clear and free of every guilty thought, which unfortunately became more and more of a challenge with each mistake she made. There was no doubt in her mind about what was coming next. Vader had assigned 8 stormtroopers to her detail. Part of her was proud, but mostly she just wanted to roll her eyes, especially when they all tried to cram into the elevator together. She was brought up to the detention block without a word of explanation. Stepping through the last door, they were met with the faces of three startled security officers.
I just thought about this. An elevator filled to the brink with stormtroopers. Like, one stormtrooper's trying to enter the elevator and sees it's completely filled up with stormtroopers. And he just has to squeeze through a bunch of stormtroopers just to get a spot, but he's completely crunched in because the elevator's so filled with stormtroopers.
But, it's strange because you watch the movie, no possible way that they're fitting 10 people in, especially with one of them is Vader-sized inside one of those elevators. Those things can barely hold 3 people. I mean, at least it's better than the Lego game in which they can only hold, 1. They were met with the faces of 3 startled security officers as they looked up from their consoles. By the way, the security officers are different than the stormtroopers. In terms of the U.S. military, think of the stormtroopers as the Marine Corps and the security guides as Army troopers. Or I suppose technically Navy troopers, since the Death Star is a ship and thus part of the Navy. It's complicated.
Yeah, they're Imperial Navy and Marine troopers. They wear black with black helmets.
To contrast with the stormtroopers' white. You know the old Empire loves black and white, also red. Leia took some satisfaction in the fact that their eyes bugged out a little. They had recognized her. Good. That meant she'd be doing her job as the official needlebug in the Emperor's side. This is prisoner 2187, one of her escorts said. The security officer shook his head, confused. But that, Senator, this is prisoner 2187, the stormtrooper repeated. Of course. In Vader's eyes, she was no longer a senator. She wasn't a princess either. She was a low enough life form that she no longer deserved a name. She was a criminal. This was going to be a tricky situation. If she couldn't convince them that she wasn't involved with the rebellion, she'd be marked as a criminal, and would likely never be able to return home to Alderaan. Not until the rebellion had overthrown the Empire, at least. And while Leia was growing more excited at the prospect of joining the Rebel Alliance fully, living, fighting, working with them every day, she couldn't wrap her head around the fact that it might be years before she saw her parents again. The security officer stared at the stormtrooper. The stormtrooper stared at the security officer. After hours of being mistreated and manhandled, Leia said, doing her best impression of her aunts, I've grown rather bored with the incompetence around me and would like to be shown to my quarters. Unless doing your jobs is asking too much. She knew full well that her quarters were a prison cell, but she jumped out of an airlock before acknowledging that fact. Very well, the security officer said. Leia was pushed forward again, and she stepped up and around the race control consoles. She scanned the badly lit stretch of hall in front of her, shivering at the freezing touch of the oxygen hissing up through the vents in the floor.
Oh yeah, you guys can't hold me here. You stormtroopers are going to be in very big trouble when my uncle, the Emperor, shows up and finds out that you're holding me prisoner.
Sam, loving the reference, but didn't we promise them no more inside jokes?
Yeah.
Okay, Sam, you do know what an inside joke is, right?
Yeah. Last one.
Okay. For real this time. We promise. And she stepped up and around the race control consoles. She scanned the badly lit stretch of hall in front of her, shivering at the freezing touch of the oxygen hissing up through the vents in the floor. From what she could see, there was only one entrance to the detention block, and that was the one she had come through. Cell door, a hatch for a garbage chute. The stormtrooper in front of her stopped so abruptly that Leia crashed into his back. They at least removed her binders before showing her inside. Leia stumbled into the long, flat sheet of metal on the opposite side of the cramped room. Her bed, if she had to guess. Whirling around, she came within a few centimeters of kicking the closed door before stopping herself. You won't get away with this, she called. Do you hear me? Leia was ready to tear the station apart, even if she had to do it with her bare hands. But first, she had to get herself out of that cell. Leia paced in circles, feeling at the seams of the walls for loose panels that could be pried off, if not to reveal a hidden escape route, then to be used as weapons. Everything on the space station was new and pristine. Turning her attention upward, she climbed onto the metal cot and scanned the ceiling. There! The red light pouring through the grates covering the ceiling had masked it at first, but there it was. A vent. A vent the size of her head. Her excitement flared out. Leia half sat, half collapsed back down onto the cot, blowing out a frustrated sigh. For that particular escape route to work, she'd need to be as small as a Kowakian monkey lizard to fit through the opening and as tall as a Wookiee to reach it. By the way, Kowakian monkey lizards, okay, they don't really look like lizards. They looked more like monkeys with beaks. They're short, they're annoying, they make weird noises, they're always laughing, they steal stuff, and they're always eating your food. They're the worst. Hungry, tired, cold, and now extremely put out, she slung her legs up and hugged them to her chest. From palace to prison, she could see the HoloNet headlines now. Darth Vader didn't keep her waiting long. Leia supposed the opportunity to watch her squirm was too much for him to resist.
The HoloNet image of Leia going from palace to prisoner won't matter. The Empire controls the HoloNet.
Yeah. I mean, not that they'd ever even let the story get out. She was, however, surprised that he was willing to do the dirty work himself. The door hissed open and his dark shape swept in, followed closely by two security officers. The two men fell into place on either side of the door, their gazes fixed on the ceiling. For a long, terrible second, there was no sound in the small cell beyond the steady wheeze of Vader's respirator. A cold drip of alarm ran down Leia's back. I do hope you find your quarters adequate, Princess. Leia raised her chin. No fear, no breaking, no screaming. Prove it to yourself, she thought. Prove that you deserve to be one of them. This was for her father and the rebellion he had helped establish, the one she would continue to help build. I demand to be released and given a formal trial, she said. Spare me your indignation, Vader said. I've neither the time nor the patience for it. A strange sound, a beeping that sizzled through the air like a bolt of static, made the hair rise on Leia's neck. Vader stepped inside, allowing a spherical droid to float in behind him. It bobbed slightly as it came toward her. Its glossy black exterior shot through with silver and punctuated by a red eye light. What? She began, pressing back against the wall of her cell. No. Gleaming silver... Another computer glitch. Gleaming silver blades and rods rose out of the destroyed shell, but Leia's eyes were focused on the syringe that emerged from its side and began filling with some kind of liquid. A wicked-looking needle, long as her hand, was aimed directly at her. Okay, sorry to cut this short. I know we've got quite a few pages left of the chapter to get through, but we've reached the 1 hour mark, and neither of us have had dinner yet, so hopefully this is enough for our first time, and... well, we'll probably see you soon. I mean, not tomorrow. Maybe not even on Monday, but...
We're going to take a few days off. But we'll be back very soon next week.
Definitely next week. We'll have a lot more to come in the month of March. We promise. Okay, we love you all, and this has been...
Star Wars Deep Digging, and I know that you are not an ambassador on a mercy mission.
We'll do little jokes like that at the end of each one. And hope you love this one. Bye!